We have obviously worked with symbols throughout the semester. For example, when you read the lottery, we talked about the significance of the black dot, the black box. In A Rose for Emily, we talked about the symbolism, potential symbolism of the rose and everyday use. Obviously, the quilts functioned as a symbol, and this is what it means to say Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix functioned as well as a symbol. It's actually an archetypal symbol, but we're not going to get into archetypal symbols today. What we are going to talk about, though, are universal symbols. Now, universal simply means that interpreting a particular symbol, the interpretation will be largely agreed upon. So, for example, a lion being kingly and regal and strong and symbolizing strength. Most of us would agree that if a lion is used as a symbol, that's how we would interpret it. Now, universal symbols are different from what nonce symbols, N-O-N-C-E. Nonce symbols are symbol systems created by a particular author, poet, playwright that has significant meaning for that particular writer. For example, Flannery O'Connor, who is a Southern writer, peacocks were symbols of grace for her. She was focused heavily on religion in her fiction, and actually grew peacocks, but anytime a peacock would appear in a short story or a novel, it would usually indicate the onset of an opportunity for grace. W.B. Yeats, who is an Irish poet and writer, used the spiraling gyre, which looks very much like a tornado, but he had this whole theory of time, and so one of his most famous poems, The Second Coming, includes a reference to the spiraling gyre, as does several other of his works. So those would be symbol systems that people who are scholars, people who research in these writers, poets, playwrights, would be very familiar with. But we're going to talk about universal symbols, especially we're going to get a little bit more deeply into this. So first, let's work with the definition of symbolism. Now, I got this particular definition from a system that we used to use in English 1102 called My Literature Lab, and this is its explanation. A symbol, to use poet John Drury's definition, is an image that radiates meaning. So there are layers of meaning. There's depth to it. Exactly what the meanings are, however, differs from poem to poem or work to work. In one poem, snow may be a symbol of innocence, and another a symbol of death. Both meanings connect to the natural image of snow, but in each poem, the image of snow implies something very different. For example, if you're familiar with the very famous poem by Robert Frost, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though he will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. And the poem ends with the idea of, I have miles to go before I sleep, miles to go before I sleep. Now, on the surface, that's a really nice nature poem, of a guy traveling home at night and stopping to admire this deep snow in these woods. But it can be interpreted on another level of the idea of keeping going even in old age, and the snow in this case being representative actually of death, that whole idea of the big sleep. And I'll show you why there's several other things working to help someone who studies that poem come to that conclusion about snow. All right, consider each potential symbol with care. Pay close attention to images involving detailed description, repetition, or placement. Don't jump to quick conclusions. If a symbol seems obvious, the cross, a rose, a reaper, ask yourself if the poem uses the symbol in unexpected ways or expected ways, or if it toys around with it. And that's what we've been talking about a lot with irony. Irony is the unexpected. Okay, irony is when the symbol does not mean what it appears to mean. And finally, if the image doesn't seem to radiate meanings beyond its literal sense, don't despair. Remember that I always recommend that you look for irony and rule it out first. A literal reading of especially poetry will often not get you anywhere, just depending. Now, there's one poem that you have in this week's lesson called I Am Offering This Poem by Jimmy Santiago Baca. And that particular poem is an example of lyric poetry, Lyric. We're familiar with the term lyric as it's connected to song lyrics, right? The words, the lines of a particular song. But lyric poetry expresses strong emotion. There's often perhaps not a lot of irony to it. The goal of the poetry is to express feeling. And so in the case of that particular poem, it literally means what it says. But most of what you'll study, especially in the canon, C-A-N-O-N, of literature, and canon is simply the accepted group of writings that scholars agree are worthy and stand the test of time. And that's definitely always under alteration and review, and definitely subject to change. So universal symbols, there's often wide agreement about the interpretation of some symbols, and I already used the example of a lion already. The color red can symbolize anger, all right, or love. So notice that there are variations, and the way that you determine how to interpret a particular symbol is dependent on what's going on around it, okay? Because normally there'll be enough information to help support that interpretation. So look at the context. All right, consider the following universal symbol pattern that is frequently used to signify stages in human life and that is employed widely in literature as well as film and song. So we're going to begin with the 4 seasons. In the upper right-hand quadrant, if you think about spring usually represents ages 0 to roughly 21, or whenever it is before somebody really launches into their careers, they're done with their education, their families, and that's actually getting older and older. It used to be that the spring of somebody's life ended pretty soon, like around 6, especially in an agricultural economy, back when more people lived in farming communities, that, you know, children went to work and very early in their lives. In some cultures, especially, you know, young men and young women are initiated around the age of 13 in the onset of puberty into adulthood. So a lot of that depends on culture. But in our particular culture, currently now, it's about until if you tend to go to college and you graduate. It's roughly 0 to 21. And this particular symbol system indicates growth and newness and beginnings and possibilities. This is when it's very forward-looking. This is where often you make mistakes and you learn from mistakes and you move forward. And it's you know, just usually symbolized by growth. Now notice that it doesn't necessarily have to do with age. For example, if you're talking about being in the spring of a relationship, you can be 45, but if you're starting a new relationship with somebody, that newness and the excitement and all of the vitality can be considered the spring of that relationship. Okay. Summer indicates very deep roots and establishment. It represents approximately 22 to 45. Again, those are rough age estimates because that definitely varies. Some of us know people who are in their 60s and have, you know, they're still like Peter Pan. They just don't age, and they don't want to, and they still have a very youthful attitude. But normally it's when you essentially establish your career, your family. There's still lots of growth, obviously, in summer, but also a lot of stability. It's kind of the idea of putting down roots. Then the autumn of someone's life, or autumn in general as a symbol, represents sort of 46 to 65. That's still very rough. It can still skew older than that. Increasingly, it's getting older. So this is when essentially it becomes you become more reflective. You look internally. You're looking at the fruits of your labor. This is often sort of moving toward retirement. Lots of reflection, change, and this is where people normally get their first intimations, unless something's happened to you earlier where you had to deal with a lot of death. This is where people become very aware that, you know, there is an end point to all of this. Then finally, winter usually is, I said 66 plus, but again, it's skewing later. All of these are skewing later and later. And this is sort of old age and all that implies. So both with the good and the bad, because externally things start breaking down, but internally it can be a very rich time. The sort of resolution, looking backward, there's a real stillness to it. Now, please notice that every season has its own beauty, all right, its own positives and its own negatives. Spring, one of the negatives of spring is that's often when it's very stormy, at least in this particular hemisphere, in this particular area. And so it's easier to be uprooted, to change constantly, to be blown about, in other words. So again, there are positives and there are negatives to each of these if we're looking at them symbolically. Now, if you're watching a movie and it begins in winter, then something's probably about to die. Okay? Please notice that. I mean, any good director worth his salt is going to kind of is going to kind of give you that climate. If you, I think of the book Metamorphosis. I don't know if you've read it, by Franz Kafka, and it's about the guy who wakes up as a cockroach, or a dung beetle, but he wakes up as a bug, and it's obviously heavily metaphoric. But this particular guy, it starts in winter, and then by the time the book's over, he's dead and the family's kind of freed of his responsibility, and they're in spring. So you can kind of see how that symbolic setting of the season actually works in this particular story. Now, these interpretations of seasonal symbols, of course, are not exact. They also have beauty and challenge in each. And, as I mentioned here, and I think I'm sort of repeating myself, but for example, the youthful period of life is characterized by energy, newness, hopefulness, and growth, but it also can be naive, impulsive, rash, and easily uprooted. All right. Now, the four directions, east, west, north, south, as well as the 24-hour day, can be interpreted in similar ways. So, for example, spring would correspond to the east. Sun rises in the east, start of a new day, right? And dawn, and which would indicate new beginnings quite frequently. And summer corresponds to the south and to midday, full sun, length of days, sense of leisure, fullness of time. So there's kind of that feeling to the south and to midday. Now, autumn corresponds to the west, and the whole idea of things getting darker, the sun's about to set. I mean, those of you who are Lord of the Rings fans, for example, remember that they sail off into the west, indicating the ending of this, period of time for Frodo and Bilbo. And then winter corresponds to the north, to midnight, all right, to deep darkness. And so that's the reason, for example, going back to the poem, Robert Frost's poem, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, that's the reason I mentioned the fact that it's at night, it's in winter. It says it's the darkest day of the year. The darkest day of the year is the winter solstice, right, which is, I think, December 21st, 22nd. So we know all of those things work together to indicate that this persona, the speaker, remember, it's not the poet. It's not that Robert Frost actually did this. He created a persona who speaks. And so this particular person encountered, this is what happened. It may be inspired by things that happened with Frost. As a matter of fact, we know that at one point he was somewhat destitute and was sort of traveling around trying to sell housewares and that kind of thing. And so it's maybe inspired by something that happened to him. But remember that poets create, except for in the case usually of lyric poetry and a few other forms, they create personas to speak for them. I went over this in the last video about how, a female poet can speak with a male voice, create, a different voice, even a different cultural voice. So it's not accurate to say always that the speaker is the poet. Okay, but in that particular poem, it's the darkest day of the year, which means there's the least daylight. We know it's at night. We know it's in winter. It's full of snow, and this whole idea of I've got to keep going. I've got to keep going. So sort of pushing himself forward, even though the temptation is to stop. So you get either somebody who either is in old age, all right, who is older in the winter of their lives, or someone who for some reason internally is experiencing that kind of winter. And it's something we all go through, I think, in different periods in life, where we have sort of a little winter period where things just seem very dark and very hard sometimes. Finally, let's talk briefly about the symbolism of color, and then we're going to apply all this to one poem. Notice that colors can work in a variety of ways. For example, white, which is often not considered a color, but white can symbolize purity, okay? But it can also be the absence of color, and it can be bland, and it can be dull. It can symbolize something that's really dull because there's no color to it. Red, as we've talked about before, with the symbolism for A Rose for Emily, red can be passion and love, but it can also be rage, someone who's enraged. I mean, think about, that's normally a really deep red would symbolize that. And notice that there are gradations. There are different shades within a color palette. Black can be sophistication. Think the little black dress, the black tuxedo, but it can also often commonly represent depression and death. Green can symbolize growth, but it can also be envy. Spring green would be associated, obviously, with spring, with new growth, with something new, okay? And there are lots of others. For example, if you're going to have to go to court for some reason and you have a lawyer, often the lawyer will recommend that you wear a navy blue suit because subconsciously we associate navy blue with truthfulness, all right? Interesting. There's certain colors that are rather what I would call grounded colors. They symbolize sort of a grounding, stability, where others would symbolize something that's a little bit lighter, more mutable, more subject to change. Grounded colors would be things like green and certain shades like forest green and brown and navy and maroon. Then, and by the way, people who work in advertising are quite aware of the symbolism of color. They get paid a lot of money to know what colors kind of represent in the national consciousness certain feelings or emotions or attitudes. The color orange, I want you, if you think about the color orange actually, especially sort of a brownish orange, more on the brown spectrum, represents economy, cheapness. To give you an example of that, it used to be Huddle House still is orange. It used to be that Waffle House was orange. They kind of upgraded to yellow when they decided to undergo a sort of a revision of their image. And the same is true for Kmart. Kmart used to be orange. And Econo Lodge, if you're driving down the road and you see an Econo Lodge motel, it's orange. It somehow or another in our, and I don't know if it started with advertisers or if they picked up on what we subconsciously connect, but orange is connected with something that's cheaper, like you can get a deal here. Now, when Kmart decided to upgrade its image, and this was 20 years ago, 15 years ago, they went with the blue and the red. And again, the whole goal there was to indicate, that they were trying to compete, I guess, up rather than down. So these are some things to think about when you're thinking about the symbolism of color. Now let's apply that to one of your poems this week. This poem is Neutral Tones by Thomas Hardy. And It's a good one to look at to show how the universal symbols support the overall theme of and the tone of the poem. I'm not going to get into the imagery, although there's overlap between symbols and imagery, obviously. But I'm going to leave that for you if you want to choose to work with it in the discussion board. So if we were in a class, we would read this poem aloud twice. If we were in a face-to-face class, I am going to read it through once, and then I'm going to walk you through some of the symbol systems here. Neutral Tones by Thomas Hardy. We stood by a pond that winter day, and the sun was white as though chidden of God, and a few leaves lay on the starving sod. They had fallen from an ash and were gray. Your eyes on me were as eyes that rove over tedious riddles of years ago, and some words played between us to and fro, on which lost the more by our love. The smile on your mouth was the deadest thing alive to have strength to die, and a grin of bitterness swept thereby like an ominous bird a-wing. Since then, keen lessons that love deceives and rings with wrong have shaped to me your face and the God-cursed sun and a tree and a pond edged with grayish leaves. All right, so the only thing I'm going to look at are this a couple of the symbols. One, symbolism of color. Second, symbolism of the season. It's winter. Winter, the death of things, right? The end of things. And so this is a poem about a dying relationship. Now the person, as we know from the fourth stanza, is looking backward. So it's in past tense, and it's the way the person is remembering that breakup. Okay? So we stood by upon that winter day. So we know immediately it's winter. That already sets the tone. The sun was white. When is the sun ever white? Well, normally it's white if there's so many clouds that it's obscured, right? That you can barely see it through all the clouds. So that too would indicate, that sense of absence. The sun was white, absence of sun, literally. Okay, when we talked about white being nothing there. So even we normally think of sun as being bright and yellow and full of life, and this day, there's no life. Okay. A few leaves were gray. Okay, notice that gray is a between color. It's not yet black or totally gone, but it's, it's gray. If something's graying, it's changing. It's turning. It's sort of a between. And so what you have here are dead, dying leaves. Okay. Also, skipping down to the last stanza, since then, keen lessons that love deceives and rings with wrong have shaped to me your God, your face, the God-cursed sun. So again, a sun, it's almost as though God cursed the sun, so it's not doing the job it's supposed to do. A pond edged with grayish leaves. So the whole setting, and again, I don't want to get into the imagery, but the whole setting indicates this thing that is dying. Okay, and there are lots of other images in this relationship that is dying. And there are lots of other images in here that would support the reading that way. Okay, notice that it's even the title, Neutral Tones. Somebody looking back, it's almost as though it's devoid of emotion. They're looking back, and there's nothing there that really feels. Okay, that the speaker can hang on to. So hopefully that's helpful. That sort of illustrates how symbols can function and support a particular idea. And so now you have your opportunity to work with it with the remaining poems.